Nazis in power. Hitler and the Nazis were able to cripple the world with their extreme ideology that targeted specific communities for mass slaughter. However, how were the Nazis able to gain political power and subvert the constitution in Germany? In this video, we aim to highlight how Hitler and the Nazis seized power by the manipulation of the laws through the constitution. Hitler was able to manipulate and outmaneuver the communists and conservatives to position himself and his party as the leader of the German nation. Once in power, Hitler was able to alter the constitution, and confine and murder his political opponents. Economy. Following the First World War, the Germans were in a state of confusion. The results of the war were ambiguous for the masses in Germany. The public was not aware of the unconditional surrender, and the whole country, including the military, were unaware of the defeat by the Allies. Moreover, 27 nations were represented at the Paris Peace Conference. However, only the Big Three settled the crucial decisions. Indeed, the three included David Lloyd George, George Clemenceau, and Woodrow Wilson. The Russians and Germans were not invited to the negotiations, which would ultimately assist in alienating the Germans. The French dominated the negotiations because they were in confrontation with the Germans. This was because of their proximity and size. Before the war and even after the war, in many respects, the Germans were the most powerful in Europe, and the British and French were fully aware of the Germans' capability. However, the United States was emerging as a unipolar power due to the growth and size of its industry. Consequently, the United States took more of an isolationist position and did not take control of the situation, which may have proved to offer a differing solution. The result of the negotiations did not include breaking Germany up into balkanized states, but rather to keep the country intact. However, the Rhineland would be occupied by Allied troops for the next decade, and the Germans would lose much of their colonies. The main goal of the Allies was to completely abolish the German military apparatus. The Allies claimed that the Germans used their military to dominate and antagonize their neighbors. Thus it remained crucial to diminish their armed services. The treaty prohibited them to manufacture or possess submarines, military aircraft, heavy artillery, tanks or chemical weapons. Sadly, this proved to be a failure for the Allies because the Germans were able to build their military quickly when needed. The war guilt clause of the treaty held that the Germans were to pay reparations for the war and to pay France and Belgium for the damages caused by German occupation. After long negotiations, the Allies agreed that the Germans owed $32 billion. In fact, the average person in Germany felt this was an economic attack on them, and they believed that the war was shifted from the physical battlefield to an economic battle that would cripple their economic status in the world. The Treaty of Versailles was given to the Germans on May 7, 1919. Consequently, they were not allowed to negotiate with any of the Allies, and it was assumed that they would tacitly sign the treaty and abide by everything included in it. They were given 1 week to ratify the treaty or face new attacks from the Allies. The Germans were extremely dissatisfied with the treaty, and many felt that they were now a part of the world subjugated. Certainly, the French were satisfied with the treaty, but the British believed that it was too extreme and could backfire concerning peace. Along with economic sanctions from the Treaty of Versailles, the Great Depression caused more poverty in Germany and crippled the world economic system. Unquestionably, this was the perfect time for a fringe political group to develop and take advantage of the horrendous economic situation. During the 1930s, the Nazis moved from a lunatic fringe of German politics to the status of the second largest party in parliament. A compound of a lost war that resulted in crippling reparations and a Great Depression placed the German economy and people in a state of panic. The economy was smothered, and inflation led to mass poverty and alienation of the average citizens. The negative status of the economy created an atmosphere for the Nazis and communists to flourish as political groups that could economically assist the masses. Nazi propaganda. The Nazis were fully aware that they could use the public dissatisfaction with the Weimar Constitution as an exploitation mechanism to appeal to the masses. They generated propaganda that labeled anyone that supported the Constitution as unpatriotic. Through physical and psychological motivation, the Nazis were able to create a propaganda model to corral a mass of followers. The Nazis compounded poverty that was created by the Treaty of Versailles and the Depression to create rhetoric that appealed to the average German. Hitler once said, "If you don't have a shirt on your back, join us, we'll give you a brown shirt." This type of rhetoric that appealed to the economic downtrodden attracted many young men, which eventually grew into the Sturmabteilung. Hitler claimed that the party would create a new national community that was not individualistic but collective. The promise that bread and work would be provided to all citizens was appealing to the masses that were subjugated to extreme poverty. Through his rhetorical speeches, Hitler was able to create in and out groups that appealed to discrimination and antisemitism. For example, he claimed that the shirkers, spongers, and parasites, most of all Jews, were not allowed in the German national community. Hitler was a media genius and the first true media politician. With the use of a propaganda model, Hitler was able to appeal to the emotions of the masses. His rhetorical pattern included a three-step process, which he would invoke the values of his audience by portraying himself as a common man that aligned with the average citizen. This appeal to the common man would gain trust, and he would next deliver insults that would create a moral panic targeting communists or Jews. Consequently, fear and desperation were instilled into the German audience, and Hitler would finally offer a solution: a better world that would be created by him and his benevolent party. This socialization process would appeal to the multitude and in many cases created a religious euphoria that spread across the German land. Conservative nationalists and National Socialists. The Nazis had a large amount of support but were unable to win through direct free elections. Additionally, both the Communists and the Nazis were gaining power that would ultimately lead to a confrontation that culminated in violence in the streets. Hitler believed that the best way to gain power within the German government was through the Constitution. He stated, "The Constitution shows us only the methods, not the goal. In this legal way, we will try to gain decisive majorities in the legislative bodies in order to pour the state into the mold that matches our ideas." Truly, Hitler was aware that the best way to control the state was through the law, and once in power he would be able to mold it into whatever ideology that he regarded appropriate. Moreover, both the Nazis and Communists were gathering more power, and each of them controlled the majority. The conservatives were concerned because they realized that they would not be able to work with the Communists and believed that the Nazis held extreme ideals. However, President Hindenburg had Article 48 and Article 53 at his disposal, which gave him the power to take steps to restore law and order and appoint a chancellor if necessary. The conservatives believed that they could tame Hitler to a less extreme dogma and use the Nazis to gain political support for their power acquisition. They planned on bringing Hitler and the Nazis into a coalition of conservatives and use them to subvert and overthrow the Constitution. The leader of the Catholic Center Party, Franz von Papen, was a trusted confidant of President Hindenburg and used that to attempt to persuade the president into making Hitler chancellor. However, the president was not fond of Hitler and even mentioned to Hitler that a presidential cabinet led by you would develop necessarily into a party dictatorship with all of its consequences for an extraordinary accentuation of the conflicts in the German people. Consequently, the president's reluctance to place Hitler in power was subverted by Papen's constant ability to persuade him and the concern that the communists would gain power. Through negotiations, Papen was able to secure Hitler as chancellor, and many conservatives believed that Hitler was the solution to the problems that the German state faced. Conclusion: the Nazis and Hitler were able to seize power by legal means through the Constitution. They were able to take advantage of a perfect storm that consisted of the economic downturn that resulted from the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression. The Nazi and Communist Party both gathered a large following and power, which resulted in violent clashes between the two belligerents. In response, the Conservative Party believed that they could tame Hitler and the Nazis and use them as a political apparatus to gain power. Consequently, the conservative plan backfired, and with the help of Franz von Papen, Hitler was able to seize power through realpolitik bargaining. With the assistance of the conservatives, Hitler was able to seize power and create a world disaster that altered the political landscape to this date.